morning, everyone. My name is Steve Primo. Some of you might recognize me as a now former member of the community from higher education. I recently joined Internet 2, so that opens up the possibility of being a room host. This session, as the title slide says, is deploying subject identifiers. If you're looking for another session, you're not in the right place. And without further ado, I will introduce Joanne Boomer from the University of Missouri.
Hi, I was the co-chair of the SAML Subject Identifiers Deployment Guidance Working Group, and I have with me Amanda Ferrante and Gabor Eszes. Got her, I'm sorry. And they both were on the working group with us and contributed greatly to our guidance documentation that was completed. So today, what we want to do is prepare you, we want you to leave here today ready to prepare you to deploy and be ready to use both subject identifiers. Today we're going to make sure we're going to go over understanding the new subject identifiers. We're going to learn deployment steps for both identity providers and relying parties or service providers. And we're also going to do an overview of the refeds access entity categories, which we also want you to deploy and fit in with subject identifiers, as you'll see in the presentation. So first, we're going to talk about why we are shifting subject identifiers. So our legacy identifiers, or the ones that we're using today, such as eduperson principal name or EPPN, sometimes people use email for their identifier or a named-based identifier, are problematic. They can be reassigned to different people over time at some places, depending on their practices, or they could be changed. A user could have a name change unless a changed identifier. They are not always globally unique or persistent, and there are some privacy risks with correlation and exposure. Subject identifiers is meant to help solve these issues. They're meant to be globally unique, persistent, and non-reassignable, that is in the spec, and they're designed for privacy and interoperability. So let's talk about what the subject identifiers are, and it is a little confusing because one of the subject identifiers is named subject-id, but when we discuss the SAML subject identifier attributes, we are talking about two identifiers, the subject ID and the pairwise-id. The Eszes SAML version 2 subject identifier attribute profile version 1.0. This is a link on the presentation that we sent in that will be on the website, we believe. Will take you to the exact spec. The subject ID is globally unique. It is meant to be persistent, meaning we don't change it when other things about an individual change, such as a name. It is not meant to be a privacy-preserving attribute. As you'll see, it goes well with the personalized information that we'll talk about in the refeds access entity categories. The pairwise-id is the unique per-user SP or relying party pair. So it is unique for each relying party for a user and a relying party. So therefore it's privacy preserving, it's non-correlatable between different systems, can't take a user ID from their system and another system and determine it's the same user because it's unique per relying party and user. Both subject identifiers share the same syntax and handling requirements, and again, we'll let the spec go into the details for you in that. And so we briefly talk about them in our guidance paper, but the spec is obviously the source for the true rules. So let's talk about the subject ID. What changing to these identifiers does is give us a chance to do a level set and get an identifier that works in our community that overcomes the problems of our legacy identifiers. So the subject ID is used for unique identification of subjects across different systems. A subject ID should have the following characteristics. It should not be reassigned. It is non-reassignable. So you should never assign the same subject ID to a different person. This is really important from a security standpoint. in identity management, that we're not letting people into services because we have reassigned the identifier to somebody else. And so we'll talk later about name-based identifiers not being a good idea because sometimes somebody else can come in later and want that identifier. We do not want that to be the case with a subject identifier. It should be unique. It should be long-term stable or persistent, meaning we don't want it to be renamed just because of some other attribute change with the individual, such as a name change. It shouldn't be renamed. It causes issues for the relying parties. When identifiers suddenly change, you might lose access to your prior content or your prior work on that relying party's service. And so we want them to be long-term stable. Opaque is also a good practice. It helps with that name-based authentication or the name-based issue. If it's not tied to the name, it's more opaque, then it's not, we're not worrying about reassigning it. It should be universal. It is not privacy preserving, and it is not intended to be known by the user. So we do not intend relying parties to display these on their application page to the user. It's still more like a back-end identifier. The pairwise-id is designed to support the privacy-preserving or the per relying party identification of users. So it is not to be reassigned per relying party. You should not give the same pairwise-id to another user with the same IDP. It is unique per relying party, it should be long-term stable, and it is also privacy preserving, so you would not use any kind of identifying information in generating a pairwise-id. So this grid compares some of our current federated subject identifiers to the new ones. So subject ID ideally would be human-friendly, but that's mostly for administrative use, so admins can interact with it. It should be persistent, non-reassignable, globally unique, and of course by design, it is meant to be correlatable across services or more personalized, and it is case insensitive, which is a change from some of our other ones. So EPPN, or eduperson principal name, for example, is used a lot in situations where we would expect subject ID to be used in the future. It is usually human-friendly, but it is not consistently persistent across different implementations. It's sometimes reassigned, so we can't say EPPN is non-reassignable across the board. And it is case-sensitive, so a capital letter could, the same thing with a capital letter and a lowercase letter could indicate two different users, and the new identifiers are case-insensitive. Likewise, with pairwise-id, it's not necessarily meant to be human-friendly. It is meant to be persistent, non-reassignable, globally unique, non-correlatable across services, and case-insensitive, where eduperson targeted ID is also not meant to be human-friendly. It should be persistent, but it's not required. It's non-reassignable, globally unique, non-correlatable, and it is case-sensitive. One of the things you'll see when we talk about the refeds access entity category, but that is important to note, is that a service provider or relying party should choose, if they need an identifier, should choose either the subject ID or the pairwise ID to ask to be released to you. Therefore, an IDP must not release both subject ID and pairwise ID to the same service provider or relying party. Doing so, of course, would compromise the privacy-preserving aspect of the pairwise ID, and so a relying party should pick one, and an IDP should enforce only releasing the one that's being requested and not releasing both in your attribute release policies. All right, so I want to talk for a moment about the refeds access entity categories. It's been a couple years since we talked about these categories here at this conference. There is a deployment guidance paper already written and out and available, and the link will be on our PowerPoint as well, or up on the website. basically, the REFED's access entity categories establish 3 categories to be used depending on the situation you want that is necessary. So there's an anonymous access entity category, which is no identifier is sent. There's a pseudonymous access category, and this is where the pairwise identifier becomes used. And there is a personalized access category where you release the subject ID, and the subject ID is used as the identifier. So these categories are used to standardize privacy and attribute release. This is the attribute releases that are required to be released per access entity category. So the anonymous access category, the only thing that should be released is eduperson scoped affiliation and SHAC home organization. The SHAC home organization, the SHAC schema is not something that's well used in the United States, but it is used elsewhere in the world. This is just a listing of what your organization name is. The pseudonymous access adds in pairwise-id and also adds in EDU person assurance. So there will be additional sessions this week talking about assurance. I recommend you attend those, and those, releasing that attribute is part of the attribute bundle. And then also the same as anonymous, the EDU person scoped affiliation and the SHAC home organization are released with pseudonymous access. The personalized access releases the more personalized information. So the subject ID, the display name, given name, SN, mail, and then also the eduperson assurance, eduperson scoped affiliation, and SHAC home organization. Within In Common, and well, actually, I believe in the world, the personalized access entity category is meant long-term to replace the RNS access category. So for those of you that are familiar or release the attribute bundle currently for the RNS entity access category, personalized is meant to replace that, and within In Common, to have the personalized access entity category assigned to your relying party, you need to meet the same requirements that we have today for the RNS access category. I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to talk about relying party guidance.
Thank you, Joanne. Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Ferrante. I'm a product manager responsible for customer identity and access with a service provider called EBSCO. Nobody at this conference ever knows what EBSCO is, so just a little bit about us. We primarily work with academic libraries, and we support a variety of different products, but our main flagship product is a platform where researchers through their library can access aggregated journal and other scholarly content. So if you have worked with your libraries and your universities, then you are probably aware they place a very high priority on data minimization and privacy preservation. So I got a lot of benefit out of participating in a group that aims to make it easier to minimize data and keep interactions private through federated identity. So today what I have for you are some practical tips and guidance that our group pulled together for relying parties or service providers, however you refer to your platform. And really what this will cover is sharing an approach to choosing the right subject identifier for your needs and start to get you thinking about how to plan and execute on a transition. We know, we acknowledge that there probably will be a lengthy transition period both for IDPs and relying parties to adopt the new subject identifiers. So something that's important for relying parties to start thinking about now is what your transition period looks like and for how long you plan to start continue supporting those legacy subject identifiers. So, as a relying party, your primary responsibility to get the ball rolling is to decide which subject identifier is right for you. And really the approach you want to take for this is by thinking about what minimum viable data you need in your product or service in order to fulfill its stated goal. If you offer personalized functionality, you have to assess the qualities of that experience and decide by design how much data is required. The REFED's access entity categories, as Joanne alluded to, provide a really nice structured way to approach this question. So for example, if your platform offers no personal functionality whatsoever and has no need to know anything about the individual user, then you probably qualify for the anonymous category, which offers no user identifier whatsoever. I suspect that most relying parties would fall into one of the other two categories, however. EBSCO in particular offers some really basic personalized functionality, essentially just a folder where researchers can save their research and come back to it later across sessions. Because we don't need to correlate the user's activity across multiple systems, we would qualify for the pseudonymous access category, and we would appropriately request the pairwise-id. However, if you genuinely need to correlate a user's activity or info about them across multiple systems, then you probably want to look into the personalized access category, which would require you to request the subject ID. The bottom line for relying parties, and really a very important rule here for all of this to work, is that you have to request one and stick with it. You cannot request multiple access entity categories, and by proxy, you cannot request both a subject ID and a pairwise ID for a single RP implementation. And when in doubt, we would encourage you to err on the side of privacy preservation. If you only need a pairwise ID at this time to fulfill your product or service's stated goals, but those goals and your product evolves in the future, you can always level up and begin requesting something less privacy preserving. So, once you know which subject identifier is right for your RP platform, you just start thinking about how to integrate it and also how to handle and validate it once you are receiving it from IDPs who are accessing. First and foremost, you want to consider treating the subject identifiers as a foreign key rather than as a primary key. I presume that many relying parties or service providers are doing this already, where if you support some sort of personalized access or functionality, you have a locally assigned ID that you're assigning to those identities or to those accounts. And you want to treat the subject identifiers as an external reference that you couple to your own locally assigned ID. This is important to start out with because it actually will help you in your transition. If you are like EBSCO with thousands and thousands of customers who will need to transition to a new subject identifier, then you will want to consider allowing IDPs to release both their legacy ID and the new and improved subject identifier to you at the same time for a period of time. So what that might look like is currently we might be receiving edgy person targeted ID and have that mapped to our locally assigned ID. And for a period of time, we would allow that same IDP to also release the appropriate pairwise ID. So having that centrally owned and managed local ID could actually help you make this transition a little bit more seamless when you're receiving both IDs at the same time. So just a little hot tip. You are going to be responsible as a relying party for validating the subject identifier that you receive. Two important points for validation. You want to look at it syntactically, so making sure that the subject ID is not malformed, that you're receiving the local identifier as well as the scope piece at the end. You also want to validate what is in the scope against what you see in the IDP metadata that you're referencing. So these are two important points to be cognizant of. If your subject identifier is malformed, or for whatever reason the scope does not match the domain or scope that you would expect to see based on IDP metadata, then those are some really important red flags that might indicate that you need to reject the SAML assertion or throw an error in some way. In terms of user experience and usability, it's also important to think about early on what you do in a scenario where you need to reject an assertion or throw an error. As Joanne mentioned, these subject identifiers are not universally meant to be human readable, and certainly if they are, if a subject ID is meant to be human readable and referenceable, we don't necessarily mean that they are appropriate to put in front of a researcher. So if you do need to throw an error, it's important to think about the usability aspect of that and what you are actually showing the researcher at the time that they aren't getting to something they need to based on a malformed ID or something like that. So long and short of it is treat them as foreign keys, validate them as appropriate so you can ensure you trust the person coming through and handle errors gracefully. There will be scenarios where a given relying party has a need for both subject identifiers. When I first mentioned this in our working group, I think it raised a few eyebrows, but I had immediately thought of a scenario where Around 95% of EBSCO customers use our flagship product in a pseudonymous way, so pairwise-id only being necessary for that folder and persistent saving of preferences and such. But a new integration that we began offering a few years ago actually allows for additional data and functionality to be pulled in from another third-party library software system into that flagship product. So we actually have, for about 5% of our customers, a need to correlate that particular user and information about the user from multiple systems. So thankfully, I was part of a group who was willing to talk through this use case with me, as rare as it might be in the community, and we thought it was important enough to call out as guidance in our final draft. And really what this boils down to is we are sticking with the guidance that you can only request a single access entity category or a single subject identifier for your relying party implementation. If you have a need for both, then you should consider breaking out a secondary RP implementation to support those disparate needs. That is the right thing to do. But as a product manager, that's a really tough hill to climb. So if any of you do work for a relying party, or you are part of a product team who has to build a business case for breaking out a new relying party implementation, I'm sure you will need to consider the complexity and cost and maintenance that that adds for your stack. And in particular, having multiple RP implementations for a single service provider product from a researcher-facing standpoint creates a lot of new challenges for institutional discovery. So quite frankly, and just sharing EBSCO's experience, we're not sure if the business case is there to continue supporting a more correlated, personalized experience for a small minority of our library customers if it means that we need to add complexity and create challenges for institutional discovery for all researchers coming to our platform. So just wanted to share that as a use case in case you fall into that category and need to think about it a little bit. Feel free to talk to me. All right, so once you have the criteria for which identifier you plan to use and how you will handle it in your platform, it's time to choose a migration approach. And really, if you are a relying party, this breaks down to choosing what you find acceptable as far as risk and reward. As I mentioned, EBSCO has quite a sprawling platform. We have over 10,000 academic library customers worldwide. So an all-at-once, one-and-done transition from legacy IDs to the new subject identifiers would not be viable. We would risk breaking stuff way too much, and it would cause a lot of concern. So we would probably err on the side of an incremental rollout, where, as I mentioned earlier, we would prompt the IDPs that we work with to send us both their legacy and their new subject identifiers at once for a particular period of time so we can ensure that we effectively map them together. A note about incremental rollout, because it sounds very low risk. The risk there is that there will be a long tail. And if you have many, many IDPs accessing your platform, you will have a long tail. So even with the incremental rollout, I would recommend time boxing and cutting it off with a forced transition for any stragglers at some point in time. If you have a smaller and more agile relying party platform, then you may actually get more reward from doing an all-at-once forced transition. It requires a lot more communication with your IDPs upfront, but again, this might be appropriate if you are a pretty agile service provider who has those channels open with IDPs whose researchers are accessing your platform. So this would be much harder at large scale, but would help you avoid the cost and maintenance of having to maintain an incremental transition. So really all that's left after all of that, which I think realistically for many relying parties would probably be in the year to multiple years worth of work, there is ongoing communication and sustaining that. So any new identity providers that come to you or begin purchasing your product if you're a commercial service provider, just continuing to keep those expectations very transparent and visible. Before I hand it over to Gabor, I would also plug a new working group that it's rolling together. This is called the Relying Party Discovery and Onboarding Working Group. And deploying and sharing guidance amongst RPs and SPs for how to integrate the new subject identifiers, I think will be just one of the topics that we discuss there. So if you are a relying party who is looking for a little bit more guidance from the community, I would Encourage you to talk to me or James Crampton or Mark Rank, who are both, I think, chairing that working group, and we can get you signed up. So with that, I will hand over to Joanne.
All right, Gabor and I are going to split the guidance for the identity provider operators. So one of the great things about this community is the working group process, and the working group process is the ability to take community feedback. So last year at this conference, we presented a midpoint where we were a midway point of where we were at and what we were thinking for our draft guidance. And we got some great feedback, and part of this section did change quite a bit based off of that guidance. So IDP responsibility is to deploy both identifiers, subject ID and pairwise-id. So we're going to talk about the subject ID first. We want IDPs to take an intentional effort to look at their IAM system or their university systems and find something that will work to meet the requirements. And basically, you have two options. You can generate a new IAM-controlled identifier for use as subject ID, which is what we recommend, or you can reuse an existing institutional identifier or IAM identifier, assuming that it meets all the subject ID requirements. So first, we want to talk about best practices for generating a new subject ID. We strongly, strongly recommend you avoid name-based identifiers, avoid mixed letters and numbers that cause confusion, things like a 0 and a letter O, or an L and a number 1. Screen your generation for offensive patterns or offensive words. So, we already do this for our username base. We have a database full of words that is scanned against to make sure we don't put any curse words or inappropriate or offensive patterns in those IDs. You would want to do the same thing for subject identifier, for the subject ID. You should plan for future proofing. This can mean a few things, but whatever you choose to do, is there going to be enough namespace to grow from here and for changes that might happen in the future? You want to assign these at identity creation. And remember that a subject ID represents a person, not a user account. So it is intended to be tied to the person. And you want to store the subject ID, ideally within your person record in your identity management system. The preferred methods for subject generation. Our preferred method that we are introducing, which came out based off conversation from last year's TechX, is called ProQuints. How many here have heard of ProQuints before? A handful. So the ProQuint example here is, this is a two ProQuints put together. I would pronounce it Zuvum Funness. It is derived from a random 16-bit integer and translated into a 5-letter string that is consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant. This makes it more pronounceable, a little bit more readable, spellable for easy communication. So for instance, in a security incident, if you are trying to communicate with an admin about a username, instead of having a very long string, it's easy to communicate via phone, it's more compact to communicate even electronically or in email, and provides a better admin experience when you're looking through for identifiers in a user application. You can use 2 or 3 or however many ProQuints you need, separated by a hyphen, to increase the namespace available. And if you do it right, you could just say, if you leave enough room, you could start with 2 and then expand to 3 as your namespace allows, as long as you plan for that and future-proof for it ahead of time. The alternative method that we did talk about last year is still UUID. You can see the difference between the prefix for the UUID versus the ProQuint, and how much more usable, readable those are. UUIDs have a low collision risk. They are well supported and standardized, but they do have poor human usability. With ProQuints, there are generators out there that will do that for you. They're just not as standard out there as UUID is today. Your second option, if you choose not to generate a new identifier, is to use an institutional identifier as your subject ID. This could be something such as your student or employee number or a system identifier. A few considerations you want to think of before choosing an institutional identifier and choosing which institutional identifier you might want to use is first, it absolutely must meet the subject ID specification rules. So if you have, if they're case sensitive or if you go out and look at the spec, make sure that they meet all of those rules. It must be globally unique, persistent, non-reassignable. Other things to consider is, does it have cross-system persistence? So if you have somebody in your student system and in your HR system, are you going to be able to make sure that they're persistent across the systems, and also your population coverage? Maybe your guests or certain affiliates or vendors don't come through your HR or your SIS system. So is it going to cover all of the population that you need to assign a subject identifier to? And if not, how are you going to handle that? Some of the risks with institutional identifiers, a lot of people are like, oh, I'm just going to use my employee ID or my student number, and from Banner or from PeopleSoft. And my next question is, hey, are you thinking about replacing your ERP anytime soon? Because that is on a lot of universities' minds right now, is switching off and into a new platform, and you may not even know what that is now. You just know that that project's coming, which is something that's happening at the University of Missouri right now. We know it's coming. We haven't made a decision on a product. I don't know what's going to happen to EMPL-ID, but if that changes, are you going to be able to handle a legacy student number or EMPL-ID and store that in your system to keep it persistent and then take new users in doing something different? How is that identifier going to be generated in the future? Is it going to be available in the new system so you can keep it without having to store it yourself? Those are all things that you'll need to think about if you want to use an institutional identifier, especially if you don't have any control over it. There could be privacy concerns. So for example, at my campus, and I know every campus, every university has a different interpretation of FERPA, the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act, but our registrar says that a student number is considered a FERPA protected. It is not directory information. And so we would not want to release student number in an identifier that could be viewed to lots of different people. And just also keep in mind identifier changes. EMPL-ID changes do happen, student number changes, things like that. So those are other things that you should consider before using an institutional identifier. So this is just kind of a grid that gives you some things to think about when choosing a subject ID generation or a subject ID strategy. A ProQuint we feel is human-friendly, has a low collision risk, although we still recommend that you check so you don't create a collision and have two people with the same identifier. It can be IAM controlled, which means you have the control to store it or do what you need with it, and you can therefore future-proof it. A UUID is not as human-friendly, but does meet the other specifications. It's even lower collision risk, but we still recommend that you check IAM controlled and future-proof. Institutional ID numbers, are they human-friendly? Well, that depends. Is it a low collision risk? It depends on your university. It's not IAM controlled, so you are at the mercy of other changes that might happen in the future. And so that's future-proofing is risky. You could use an internal IAM identifier that you already have. Is it human-friendly? Well, that might depend. But you probably are already checking for collision risks. You already control it. And depending on your IAM system, it may or may not be future-proofed. If you're planning to transition IAM systems, say you're on a vended product and you're going to go to midpoint and you're going from one to the other, are you going to be able to take that with you so the subject identifier remains persistent? Name-based identifiers, again, we strongly discourage. Yes, they're human-friendly, but it is, you can collide with similar names. You have to manage that. They're not always IAM controlled, especially You know, if they change when name changes, it's hard to future-proof for those, especially if you have a large user base. You know, the name-based identifiers get used up really quickly when you have a lot of Smiths. There's only so many variations of a J. Smith or a John Smith that you can come up with before you're completely out of namespace. So those are just some of the things we want you to think about. I'm going to turn it over to Gabor now, who's going to talk about IDP responsibilities in deploying pairwise-id.
Thank you, Joanne. So, you know, as you know, the IDP has some specific responsibilities with regard to pairwise-id, because it's really important that a distinct pairwise-id be released to a different SP, even for the same user, obviously. This means that there's a specific technique that the IDP must deploy in the generation of these things that we'll get into here in a moment. But the basic rules, other than that, are familiar from those of subject ID. It has to be persistent, non-reassignable. Deterministic is a property you're going to want to get this working correctly, because you want there to be a mathematical mapping between the origin identity and whichever derivative identities or derivative values you're going to be sending to each SP. And just to reiterate, do not release both the subject ID and the pairwise ID to the same SP, otherwise you're breaking this whole idea. So when you get down to it, how are you going to derive these values that the pairwise ID is going to take? Our recommendation in our document is to use keyed hashing, which is a deterministic stateless method that gets you the result that you want. The one property of that is it's non-reversible, so it's a one-way transformation. In our document, we go into a bit of algorithmic detail on how you could achieve this. Read the document if you want details. This does leave you with a couple key management caveats. You want distinct keys per SP. You want to have secure keys, and obviously because they're keys, you want to keep them private. If you don't do any of these things, they could put your users at risk, and somebody could figure out how to generate these values. An alternative method that does actually have some deployment in the wild, but isn't as common as keyed hashing is encryption. You can encrypt. You get some different properties when it comes to the length. The hash, of course, maps dynamic size values into a fixed size output. Encryption will map a similar size input to a similar sized output. So you have some namespace management concerns there, but one interesting property of the encryption is that it is reversible. That could actually be quite handy for cases when let's say you get some logs. Let's say you're doing certify, right? The certify exercise, and you get some logs from the relying party that says that this person, this identity identified by this pairwise ID is engaging in something. And if you use encryption, then you actually, because you hold the key, you can actually reverse that and figure out what the seed identity was that went into that, and you'll be able to identify the person on your side without having to keep like a list of these things ahead of time. When you run through these algorithms, you get, of course, a numeric output. You want to serialize that into a string. We recommend that you use base 32 because the result must be case insensitive. Base 64 is something you're probably quite familiar with, but base 64 is in fact not, does not satisfy that property, so you have to use base 32. You do have an alternative here, an external alternative. You could use UUIDs. The same properties apply as they would for subject IDs. However, your storage needs are going to be very different because you have to now store that value that you minted for each recipient relying party, and that could be a pretty big storage need. So when you make your decision on what to use, think through these things, and our deployment document will help you make those decisions. Now, wrapping up from the IDP perspective, Definitely, when you engage in this process and you deploy these as an IDP, you want to map your old identifiers to the new ones and minimize changes except when truly necessary. You don't just want to make change for the sake of change, and those should go into your design considerations. When migration is needed, you want to notify the affected SPs so they can perform the mapping on their side also. And do maintain the audit trails so you know what exactly happened, and be prepared to make that available to parties that need the troubleshooting. And in overall, as an IDP, you have to make available pairwise-id for SPs that ask for it, and you have to make available subject ID for SPs that ask for it. But we recommend that you base your attribute release primarily on RefEd's access entity categories, because that is what that specification was specifically designed to do. You want to leverage that work and not have to reinvent that machinery yourself. Use the signaling to automate the release. And when somebody goes contrary to the spec and signals themselves as more than one of these things, then do make the same choice as we advise relying parties to make, which is to pick the more privacy-preserving option rather than the more privacy-revealing option. And then what's next? What are the key takeaways here for you all in this room is understand which of these two identifiers, the subject ID and the pairwise-id, are appropriate to use and when. Understand that even though they can look similar, the intent behind them is quite different. We do encourage you to configure your products for RefEd's access entity categories. That is work you definitely want to benefit from as you work on rolling out support for these subject identifiers. Please do engage with us in this process. We do want to hear any challenges you're running into with this process. You might have heard us saying this in many other sessions, but we want to achieve deployability. We want to see a world where people are making use of this guidance and actually deploying it. So if things are preventing you from moving forward on that, we want to hear those, and that may inform steps that we take as a community to figure out what we need to do to get rid of those blockers and move forward. In the previous session in this room, you had heard about the Federation Expectation Program, which was a program that we're rolling out specifically to address this sort of missing piece, I should say, of, we have deployment guidance ready to go. We've already put in the work. We just need folks to take the next step and adopt it, and then we, as in all of us, need to then keep ourselves honest and measure how far we are in achieving the future that we want to achieve. So that program will hopefully help provide the structure necessary to get those work streams sequenced. And now we have time for questions. The actual guidance is available at the link, and the QR code will take you to the same link.
Chris Bongerter from Minnesota. I currently release EduPerson principal name to all of EduGain as the default. And RNS also gets name stuff. Should I be releasing in the future subject ID and or pairwise-id? Probably not and. And given that case, if the answer is pairwise-id, how can I safely do that? How can I transition to that safely while also still releasing EPPN, which is equivalent kind of in privacy considerations to the subject ID?
Yep. Let's take it. Yeah, so as you said, the EDU person principal name is closely similar, analogous to the subject ID. And so if you have relying parties that are receiving EDU person principal name, the cat's sort of proverbially out of the bag there, because once they've received that value, they can continue to identify the person. So it is, that is certainly things to work out with service providers, whether it's possible to reboot the user population. It's certainly not something that would be impossible. That's a conversation you may be able to have with your service provider. In that sort of case, if you want to stop sending a personally identifiable identifier to a specific relying party and transition to a pseudonymous identifier, the pairwise-id, you could, because there's no continuity between those values, they actually wouldn't know who that corresponds to without extra identifying information. So. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I would just second Gabor's point that it is a very interesting but very likely use case that your researchers are currently authenticating to service providers using a less privacy-preserving identifier, and at the time those service providers adopt the access entity categories or requesting a new subject identifier, they will need to account for how they handle having less privacy-preserving information in their system, but now needing only, say, a pseudonymous model. That will be a challenge, certainly, for relying parties, but to Gabor's point, I think that they will need to handle that on a case-by-case basis. So just something to think about. I would agree with talking to them if you're concerned.
Maybe a good topic for ACAMP or the working group you mentioned.
Yeah, hi, Tom from Canary. I'm just curious if InCommon has any early adopters of Subject ID on the IDP side and how that went, or any sharing of lessons learned?
On the other side of the room, I do know that CI login. So if you could speak about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, hi. Yeah, Jim Basney, University of Illinois. NCSA, actually. So for the NCSA IDP, we're using EPPN value as our subject ID value because it already met the criteria, even though I understand it's one of the less recommended options because it's name-based. From the CI logon perspective, we started accepting subject ID, and for existing entries, we really appreciate the IDPs that are providing us subject ID and EPPN, and then once we get that subject ID for an EPPN that we've seen before, we add it to the record and we use subject ID going forward.
Other questions? This is how I get my steps in.
Björn from Sunet in Sweden. One thought. You said that both request an entity category and the subject ID. Isn't it enough only to request the entity category? Because you have, in personalized, you already have subject ID, and in pseudo-anonymous, you already have the pairwise ID. So it would be easier for the IDP only to check for the entity category and ignore, it doesn't have to check for the subject ID requirements.
Yeah.
So I think it should be best said, only request entity category, doesn't request any other thing, because you get it through the category.
Yep. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily think of these recommendations as independent of one another. As soon as I learned about the access entity categories and this subject identifiers deployment working group, the obvious light bulb moment was if we meet requirements for access entity categories, then we get everything done. So I would agree that probably the most straightforward way for us as a community to make progress on this particular recommendation is to prioritize access entity categories.
One more question. Okay.
Clarification on that, and this is a bit of a rabbit hole. Obviously, you can use subject identifier in situations where you don't need the other entity attributes as in entity categories, specifically in common. because we're tying the qualification for a personalized category to RNS, that rules out pretty much every commercial SP at this point. So that makes the personalized category, at least for United States, right now, not nearly as useful. We do need to work on that. And the challenge there is how do we get qualified certification body to certify the right SPs and have the IDP trust that certification so that generically release works. So this is where the different profiles and specifications start to interact and inadvertently create maybe unwanted complexity.
Hi, this is Mark from the University of California, Irvine. We're in a situation where obviously we released the historical eduperson and principal name and targeted ID for SAML, but OIDC is greenfield for us right now, and so I can't help but notice, the correlation here between the OIDC spec and what you're using for SAML, and so I'm wondering if you could discuss that or whatever.
Yeah, so OIDC actually has the notion of I forget what their term of art is, but a pairwise subject identifier, similar terminology, right? So we believe that our work is directly adaptable to the OIDC protocol, right? Of course, the surface of interaction, right, is at the access entity category level, which is why we try to craft our guidance in a way to advise you to benefit from as much of the work of the reference access entity categories as you're able, if that use case works for you, but the guidance is able to stand alone if that is work that you're not immediately capable of picking up. So I would think that it does translate well to the particular protocol elements that are present in OIDC. And I think we are out of time. Yeah, we're happy to have a ACAMP session on this, so get your suggestion on the board at the ACAMP agenda setting on Tuesday morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.